excited to have Coventry Edwards Pitt on the show. Coventry is the Chief Wealth Advisory Officer of Ballentine Partners, a firm that specializes in providing investment and wealth management advice to wealthy families and entrepreneurs. Covie, as she's called, leads the firm's wealth advising practice and several of the firm's large family client engagements. She began her career with Goldman Sachs after graduating from Harvard. Currently, she serves as the chair of the Professional Advisor Committee of the Boston Foundation, and recently she's published a book titled Raised Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise, Lessons from Successful Inheritors, on how they got that way. And this can be found online at Covie at raisedhealthywealthywise.com. And the book offers key insights on why some children raised in the 1%, or some children raised the 1% of what, socioeconomic, 1%, do well and others don't. So Covie, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And this is a very interesting topic. I know for a fact that there are so many people who talk about these things on a daily basis, the grocery store, PTO meetings, book groups.
Yes, exactly.
So this is something that's really of concern to many people, and not just those who are in the 1%, but to many, many people.
I appreciate your insight about that. It really cuts across socioeconomic levels, and it's applicable beyond the 1%.
Right. So I'm going to start by asking you a fun question.
Okay.
So, so what did you have an inkling that you were going to do this as a career? Not the book, but the wealth management.
Right. Well, so interestingly, I was actually pre-med all through college, and I had decided to be pre-med because I really wanted to help people, and I saw being a doctor is the highest calling. I ended up not doing that because of how the medical profession was changing, and I ended up doing recruiting, and I ended up at Goldman. So totally different situation.
Right.
Through that, I learned investing, and after I left Goldman, I discovered the field I'm in now, which is called fee-only advising, which is consultative, it's objective, it's no product sales, and that was a perfect marriage for me of the technical expertise. Financial expertise is different than medical, but you have a technical expertise that you bring to a very human, close relationship with people in service of really trying to help them.
Right, and that's really interesting. I find that that's a theme with you, that you really want to help people.
Yes,
and
that's true.
You know, one of your reasons possibly for writing this book, being in wealth management.
Yes.
You started off in the medical field and then gravitated over here. So
exactly.
that's a theme.
Thank
so it's
you.
a social consciousness.
Yes. Well, I appreciate your thinking that. It's very true.
And so did you have mentors in high school or at home, parents, who spurred you on to do the good, give the good fight and good causes?
Yes, yes. Well, so first of all, my mom, I was raised largely by a single mom. My parents were divorced when I was young, although they're great friends now. But my mom's an attorney, and she was an attorney for 35 years. And so that was my image of a parent. It was a working mom who was doing a great job raising me, but also doing a great job in her career. And she always told me I could do whatever I wanted to do as long as I worked hard. So that was a really powerful mentor in my life. And then I was very fortunate at Goldman to be put into a group with a senior woman who was a senior leader in the investment field. There weren't that many at that time, and she was just a phenomenal person. Her name's Tracy McHale Stewart. She runs a hedge fund now out of New York called Corbin, and we're still good friends. And she was an authentic leader, and she was just herself, and that was such a powerful example. And then, of course, the founder of our firm, Roy Ballentine, he's really taught me everything I know in this field, and he supported this research. He supported this book. He's always supported us going deeply into the issues that will really most help our clients, and that's why I joined the firm 10 years ago, and it's still true today. So
do you find that you know your clients really well?
Yes, very well.
Really, really well.
I have served the same 10 or 11 families for about 10 years.
Right.
So,
right. So you know, like, every last one of their issues.
Yes. Well, you know,
puts you in a great position to then do case studies. And
yes. Well, part of what drove this book is that pretty early on, I mean, as I'm drawn to helping people, what I really wanted to most deliver to my clients was peace of mind. And we offer a lot of technical advice on estate planning and investments and stuff. And of course, that's all great. And with our help, they really didn't worry about those issues anymore. And then what I found that they were really worrying about were their children, as any parent can understand. And so especially issues around how they were interacting with their kids financially, whether supporting them or gifting to them. And so I became very interested in this topic and started reading heavily about it myself.
Did you have a moment with respect to writing the book? Did you have a moment that that you decided, upon which you decided that this is something that I want to do. I want to write a book
Yeah.
about inheritance and sustainability.
What's interesting is, as I said, I have on my bookshelf at home is parenting advice. My bookshelf at work is parenting advice and wealth. And so I own something like 30 or 40 books on this topic. And something I realized as I was reading all these books, and I came to this realization about 2 or 3 years ago, the book I really wanted didn't exist. And that was a book that found successful kids who were raised with wealth and just asked them how they got that way. How did they end up content, motivated, productive? And as I started looking for that and realized it didn't exist, the thought occurred to me one day, why don't I just write this? I mean, I have examples in our practice. I can go outside our practice.
And you've checked out the competition. You have all the books ever written about the subject.
And there are some great books that offer a lot of nuts and bolts advice, but I really wanted stories of real people. I wanted to put all this advice to the test of a real life.
And so in the book, do you have pros and cons, or like success stories and stories that are not so successful?
I just have success stories. I mean, my field is filled with the not success stories because, first of all, that's what advisors like people like me end up spending a lot of our time helping with. And there are a lot of memoir kind of books that talk about how difficult it actually can be having a lot of money. What I really wanted to focus on, because I had some examples in my practice, was very tangible, concrete, verbatim quotes from real people who experience this themselves. And so they're all anonymous. The way I got people to participate in this project was guaranteed anonymity. But aside from that, all the quotes are verbatim, and that makes it very, it comes to life.
Right, it's very real life experiences as opposed to something that may be fictitious.
Exactly.
And I think people have a feel for that when they read the book. They can sort of parse between what seems legitimate and sincere versus what's not.
Right.
So that's awesome. So that's a great backstory. And this book is different because it really has those case studies. And how many case studies are in the book?
So I interviewed 25 people, and then what I did was the task I found actually very challenging was to structure all the messages I learned from the interviews. And so and I've done that work, so I think that is one of the things that makes the book easily readable. It's that it's categorized into 5 very practical, tangible chapters, and the stories are woven throughout, but the chapters are very easy to follow, like one on setting limits and holding kids accountable, one on work ethic, one on the most key values and messages to community to kids. And the last 2 chapters are about what happens when they come out of college and how to interact with your kid financially in those critical period of the 20s and early 30s.
Because that is a very tricky time.
It's very tricky, particularly
both in the lives
this
of the parents and the kids.
Yes, exactly. Well, what comes across loud and clear is kids really like feeling like they were given the chance to prove that they could do something on their own. And that happens to be sometimes very difficult for a parent when a kid is first coming out of school, they're first looking for a job, the parent knows they don't like whatever job they're in, and especially if you have a lot of resources in your life financially, it's very tempting as a parent to think, how could I use some of this family money to help the kid do something they're more passionate about, and essentially remove them from whatever job they're slogging through day in, day out, not enjoying. And it turns out that that's probably not very helpful, because if you think of what really teaches someone what they love, it's putting in some time at a place that wasn't great, and they learn what they don't like.
It's experiential. There's
Exactly.
no better teacher than experience.
Exactly, and everyone's kind of got to go through it on their own.
Right. So that's, and working with the 1%. I like this book so much because I have so many sayings that are appropriate for this book, such as, money does not buy happiness.
Yes.
So I was going to ask you, did you find through some of your case studies that, I know you want to focus on the positive, the success stories, but did you find through not just for the book and the case studies, but people you manage, did you find that money does not actually buy happiness?
It's hard for me to think of an example where money has bought happiness. I think money buys choices and opportunities, and what it never really buys is the contentment that is given to someone through finding meaningful work that sustains them, feeling like they succeeded on their own, and that they had a self-built resilience that they earned on their own. That money, if anything, disrupts the ability to develop those, although never, it's always best intentions, but unfortunately it ends up disrupting the development of those things.
And I think it's interesting also because it's not just the 1% of people that we're talking about. I think living in America, as opposed to other parts of the world, it's much easier to so-called spoil your child even on a low income or middle income
yes, I've heard
family
this.
status.
I totally agree, and I've heard this from a lot of people who've read the book, that in some ways it's called Raised Healthy, Wealthy, Wise, and so people think, oh, it's only for someone not like me, but actually the lessons cut clear across almost all levels of socioeconomic spectrum, because if you think of two main trends going on, one is with Walmart and trinkets worth $1, you don't need a lot of money to overindulge a child or surround them with toys that they may no longer appreciate because they have too many. Same thing with helicopter parenting. You know, I think that this is something we've heard about a lot. And when parents are so trying to be involved in kids' life, it can actually become difficult as a kid to either feel like they succeeded on their own or that they made it through some setback on their own, because a lot of problems are being solved for them. And I address both of these themes a lot. Money tends to further exacerbate those issues, but it can happen at really any level.
And at what percentage would you estimate of your clients are frugal with respect to raising their children, even though they're wealthy?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question.
I know you like numbers, so...
Right. Good. I like numbers too. I think this is a difficult question to answer, because in some ways things can be very relative or varied. So for instance, you could have a family that is frugal about specific spending decisions, like, no, we won't buy that. But then it'll come time to give an annual gift. And so they'll give $14,000 to the child's bank account or to a trust, but then they'll talk to the kid about how there's $14,000. And this can become very confusing to children. What I find is most successful, almost regardless of how frugal or not parents are, is parents sticking consistently to some core messages. You know, one being, just because we have money doesn't mean we need to spend it. Two being, people and character are more important than money. And then there's a whole emphasis on gratitude and a sort of sense of perspective, that there was a time when our family didn't have this money. There may be a time again, and you should be able to be okay and be able to thrive in either circumstance.
Do you find that with respect to raising children, wealthy parents might have similar issues with perhaps, I'm trying not to deviate too much, but with respect to parents who live in other countries, for example, not just America, but
yes.
Similarities with people of different socioeconomic levels?
Yes. Well, you know, I interviewed a gentleman from India, and he was fascinating to talk with, because he said he grew up in a very affluent setting. They had 5 permanent household help. They had 3 live-in people and 2 chauffeurs. But notwithstanding this, and this is what I thought was so fascinating, where it comes really down to the parents intentionally creating an environment where the children are asked to have certain responsibilities that are non-negotiable. He and his brother every day had to set the table, take their food away from the table. They had to make their own bed, and notwithstanding there were 2 chauffeurs, they had to get themselves on their own to any sporting event for school. And he said, nowadays, especially in where I live in America, this would be seen as insane. You know, especially where kids are shuttled back and forth everywhere. And it takes an Excel spreadsheet to keep track of everyone's, you know, that usually the parents are doing.
I try not to put my Excel spreadsheet out on the refrigerator for other people to see.
Right, exactly. But, you know, but he said it actually taught him such a sense of self-reliance that he could get anywhere he needed to on public transportation or just getting rides with people. And that's, I think, such a powerful lesson.
Wow, that's neat. So were you surprised by any of the people that you came across, or the case studies?
Yeah.
Did any of them ever go counter to what you expected?
Well, I approached this with a real intent to really peek under the hood of a lot of accepted industry norms and really try to understand whether what I've heard about in the industry is the best approach. And one of the things I learned that I would say is very counterintuitive, there's a spectrum about how much everyone's always asking the question, how much do I tell my kids about how much money I have, and when do I tell them how much money they're going to get? And there's a spectrum ranging from complete secrecy. A lot of parents tend to be there, I don't want them to know anything, and kids use Google and figure out a lot, to complete transparency. And a lot of the industry advocates family meetings and talking about details and educating. And what was really interesting is what comes across in the book is there is a middle ground that is optimal. And what's interesting about this middle ground is kids know that there's money. The parents have never lied that there's money and we live in a nice house or whatever. But the kids, through a lot of the lessons the book talks about, have a real sense that the money is not their money. It's their parents' money. And there is a sense that they will someday get money, but it's very vague and it's not specific. And because of that uncertainty, they are then left to focus in their own lives in that critical period of the 20s on their own productivity and their own ability to earn some money. And what's interesting is I had one guy that I interviewed who said, look, I'm a writer, it's the very uncertainty I have about whether what I will eventually inherit will be sufficient for me to live off of that motivates me to write every day. He said, my job is very difficult, and I have all these sort of inner qualms about whether what I'm doing is good. And he said, I need that extra little kick of economic necessity to just propel me to write. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that's fascinating. And that's not something that you hear about a lot in the wealth advising industry.
Right. I think it's difficult for parents to create that balance.
Right.
You don't want to over-terrorize your children that you're going to run out of funds at any given point.
Yes.
And then one day find out that you had lots of money and there was no need for that.
Exactly.
And you also don't want to over-spoil your children and say, oh, this is how much you're going to get, so don't worry about it.
Exactly. You're so right. Honesty is key. And one of the families in this book said something so beautiful. They said, the money is here. Hopefully you'll never need it. And that's how they struck that balance. They weren't lying, but they were also saying, your task in life is to develop your own productivity, and you don't need to be wealthy, but self-sufficiency is a good goal.
Yeah, that's a great saying.
Yeah,
right. And I see that in your book you touch upon the importance of having a summer job.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about why that's
important. I'm a big proponent of that. So they've kind of gone by the wayside a little bit with enrichment experiences and volunteer experience, and those can all be great, but there are certain things that a summer job teaches a kid that they are very hard-pressed to learn in other circumstances, especially if they come from an affluent or semi-affluent setting. One is just the sheer experience of earning their own money, especially if they come from parents where the domain of earning money and financial success has always been something mom or dad do. It's really a transformative experience for them to have the first experience of getting money, opening a bank account, putting it in, the basic equation of if I want to spend, I need a certain amount, how do I budget that? That all flows from that first experience of getting their own dollar. The second thing is having a boss. You know, that is not something, especially if you've been raised in an affluent setting and your parents run companies, and there's been high expectations of your own personal achievement. You're sort of thinking, I am destined for career greatness, and a la Mark Zuckerberg or something else. And that all may be true, but there's no better experience, as we were saying earlier, than working for a boss, whether you like them or not, in terms of being your own leader someday.
So a down-to-earth backroom McDonald's,
yes,
fry shift station for the summer.
Yes, I highly recommend it because, and the third point, getting out of your socioeconomic bubble. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of us who live in wealthy or other, your child may never have seen a two-family house. I mean, they may never have seen anyone who lives in a different situation than they do. And they may through volunteering, but that's a very different experience than working peer-to-peer with someone with a common goal, all being held to the same standards. A lot of the kids in the book, when I interviewed them, said that was the first time they met a whole different walk of life and had a real understanding of the privileges they had actually been raised with, that they up until this point had pretty much taken for granted.
And I'm sure you must have come across families who've traveled. They've
right.
taken their kids to Africa or China
right.
or other places. So they've had some exposure to how other people in other parts of the world live.
Right.
Do you think that makes an impact on their thinking, even though it's a short trip and they don't have to live there? But
yes, I think it does make an impact, but I think there's a way to do it that is most impactful. Something that came across in the book was kids actually really benefited from a self-funded travel experience probably right out of college, and self-funded was key. So it wasn't just like, here's yet another enrichment experience that is being foisted upon me and that I'm supposed to be enriched by, but one guy said he wanted to get as far away from everything his family wealth sort of offered him where they still spoke English, so he went to Australia and he worked on a cattle ranch that had a 40-mile long driveway. And he said this was the first time in his life the guys he was working with had never heard of Yale, they'd never heard of his family, and all that mattered was he a nice guy? Could he lift the stuff that they did? And he said that was really an amazing experience in terms of showing him who he was as a person. And it wasn't necessarily all this stuff that had been part of his identity. It was really a much more core and foundational self-worth. So I think that can be very helpful, that kind of experience.
How do you suggest that parents should set limits, even though they're at the 1%?
Right.
How should they set limits for their children?
Right. So in some ways it really doesn't relate to whether they have money or not. So I think a big concept for parents to feel comfortable with is they can say no. It doesn't matter whether they can afford it. It matters whether they need it or whether they think it's important for the family to have. So a great example from the book is one of the guys I interviewed said that everyone in their neighborhood had a pool. And so all the kids wanted a pool, so they asked the dad, can we have a pool? And he said, we live 5 blocks from the beach, we don't need a pool. And then everyone had a Lexus. So they said, well, we want a Lexus. And he said what his father said was, Number one, our car's fine. Number two, just because that person has a Lexus doesn't mean necessarily they have a lot of money. They might have gone into debt to get that. And it was an education in appearances not necessarily being reality, and material possessions not indicating anything fundamental about a person's character. And that was a very useful lesson pretty early on.
And so it's useful to have conversations, frankly, about money while the kids are growing up, as opposed to not talking about money at all, or talking about it as though it's a stressful situation.
Exactly. It's very useful. And I think this is the other thing that sometimes gets glossed over, that you buy something off of Amazon and it gets delivered in a box, and the kid never experiences okay, you have $10, you need to go through the store and you need to pick the thing that's going to fall under that $10, and that experience of choice. And yes, I can't get everything I want, and that's okay. I think we all have to remind ourselves as parents to engage with our children on those topics. Another thing that comes from the book is talking to your kids about work. The good and bad of your day. Part of what comes across in the book is children learn so much from being included in that conversation. And I think as parents, we're all running around and we think, oh, well, here's my couple hours, so I'm going to just focus on Legos or whatever it is they want to do. But actually bringing the children into that, here was my day, and here's what was challenging, and that can actually be very instructive.
Right. And so from your experience working in wealth management, what percentage would you estimate are success stories of people who've passed wealth on to their children, and the children have managed to sustain and grow it?
Well, there's actually a statistic that, there's a statistic that floats around in our industry that I think is pretty much borne out by the situations I've seen, that it's about only 30%, and that 70% of families fail to successfully pass money on. And it's not about the type of estate planning they're doing, although sometimes that's a problem, but it tends to be just whether the children are prepared to understand in their own lives how to be productive, rather than just simply dissipate the wealth.
So I just had when I first heard of your book and I was reading up on it, I had this memory of reading something about Charles Dickens and how he had 10 children, and he was disappointed that not one of them was as successful as he was. So I was laughing to myself. I said, this is a very interesting topic indeed.
Yes. Well, that's an interesting point, too. What I didn't see a lot of in the people I researched was any requirement from the parents that they do or become any specific thing. The parents basically said, again in a very nice balance, whatever it is you want to do, aim high and do that to the best of your ability. But whether you want to be a doctor or an actor or whatever, we don't really care, as long as you can support yourself. And that created a real sense of freedom. And I had people all over the map who did a lot of different, I think when it's, I need to be as successful as my parent in whatever that little narrow thing was they were, it's a really tough road.
Right. And do you find that most of these children who've been successful branched out on their own to start their own businesses or do their own thing, or did they follow in their parents' footsteps?
Most of them did something pretty independent, sometimes informed by, like I had one guy who had grown up with a father in a real estate business and a mother who was very philanthropic, and learned through that the power of fundraising. And when he went into the art field, he was very good at raising money for the shows he wanted to put on, the art shows he wanted to put on, by the experience he had had growing up.
Right. So tell me, if you were to write a sequel to this book, it's a kind of a trick question, but what would the title be for the next book after this?
Oh, that's interesting. I've actually thought about this, because I think once you write one thing, people start asking, what's the next thing? And
sure. About 2 days after.
Right, exactly. So one thing that's just interesting to me is this is very focused on how to raise children well. Something that I have also been interested in our firm through my work with my clients is what to do at the other end of life in terms of aging, and how to age well. And especially if you're an advisor like I am to people who have all the financial resources they need, how do you use those to really maximize your time? And so that's something I thought of.
And when do you transfer the wealth?
Exactly.
Right.
There's a whole other, that's a whole other issue, because people are living longer now.
Right.
So the whole plan that the kids will inherit when you die, sometimes the kids now are 85, because, well, not exactly that old, but
only if you're Queen Elizabeth.
Right, exactly. I mean, people do, I know a situation where the family inherited the money at 74 because the mom lived to 99. And so that's another, which of course does help the children with their productivity in their own lives.
The grandchildren will be perfect. They'll be all set. They've been raised with like no money in the family, right? Until that point.
Right, exactly.
Well, great. So yeah, What was, let's see, I think you had mentioned success factors?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Feel free to talk a little about that.
That's an interesting thing, because something I have been asked when people say, oh, so you interviewed these successful people, how is that defined? How is success defined? Right. And does it mean they became really wealthy or whatever? And what's interesting is part of the research I've done through this has uncovered what I view as 4 fundamental success factors that every parent should shoot for when they're thinking of what to help their kids develop.
Good. We have a list. All right.
Right, because I think every parent wants to help their kid, right? So the question is, help them do what? And I think the short answer is help them be emotionally and financially self-sufficient. But what does that really mean? So if you're thinking of 4 things, the first one would be allow them to have the experience of earning their own money and living largely off of that money. And all of these people I interviewed lived largely off of money they earned, and more importantly, knew in their own heart that if the money from the family went poof tomorrow, whether or not they were accepting some family help, they knew if that money went poof, that they would be content living off of money that they themselves could earn. And that was so important for their self-esteem. Most people said it was not until they reached that point in their lives that they felt a sense of real self-worth. So I think that's fascinating. The second thing is that they have a sense of being able to set and pursue their own vocational goals. To your question about, is the parent saying, do this, do that? They have a real drive. They have identified something they want to do, and they're able to go off and do that. Now, we can talk about passion if we still have time, but I would just say people sometimes make a mistake by saying, go do whatever you're passionate about. That's not a bad message to say you should like your work, but it
needs a little more definition.
The passion thing has gotten very, in some ways, debilitating, because kids show up and think, oh, gee, the first day of work, if it's not the thing they're
fun,
it's like, I'm out of here, right? Especially if they've got their annual gift sitting in their bank account.
Yeah, passionate is confused with fun sometimes.
Exactly, and the reality is that, so the better message is, yes, you should find work you love, but that might take a while. And in the meantime, learn from any job, and every job that you could have has value. So the third thing is that these children had a sense of self-worth that was not wholly wrapped up in either the family name or the family affluence. And that really was built for them largely by their own work and the sense of self-contribution they got from work that they had found. And the final thing is a sense of resilience. Kids need to feel like if things go badly, they'll be able to pick themselves up, and they have the inner strength to be able to do that. And back to the gentleman I interviewed from India, I mean, just getting himself to and from things in high school years, he ended up becoming a serial entrepreneur. I mean, you have to pick yourself up many times in that situation. And he went back to that period. He said, that actually gave me such a sense of self-confidence.
Well, it's a good thing in my family. My motto is fail big and often.
Yes.
I'm so happy to hear that's going to work well.
Exactly. And learn from it. Exactly.
Yes. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully learn from it.
Exactly.
So what's number 4? Is that
was it. So yeah, earn
4?
money and have set and pursue your own vocational goals, have a self-worth that's not wholly wrapped up in your parents' money, and then resilience that's hard-earned on your own.
Right. Neat. So, that's a good list.
Yeah.
And let me ask you, how does instant gratification versus delayed gratification work into that?
Yeah, well, so I'll give you a good example from the book. A father came to his son about 3 years before he could get his driver's permit, his learning permit, and said, look, you're probably going to want a car in 3 years, and if you want to start saving now, I will match it. I forget up to what percentage, but I will match. And so the son did that, and he saved, and then he bought the car with the combination of funds. And what he has told me is that what's interesting is a couple years later, when it was his brother's turn, the father bought the car off of the first son and just gave it to the younger son.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And so even in families, there can be sometimes different messages. And this older brother attributes his work ethic to the fact that's how he was treated, this sort of expectation of personal responsibility and contribution, whereas he thinks his brother learned a very different lesson, which is that sometimes things can just be handed to you.
Right.
So
you should go shopping with the older siblings so you can pick out what you want eventually that you're going to get.
Right. So it comes back to parents having to intentionally create opportunities for their children to learn things about saving, self, limits, holding kids accountable, and
So it's a big parental responsibility list we have here.
It is, but the good news is, if you're looking for, the book's on Amazon, but if you want a short list, at the end of the book, I tried to summarize the lessons, and I put it in the format of a thank you letter from the inheritors to their parents.
Oh, nice.
And I've just been using this myself in my own.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, and I've just been using it myself in my own parenting. Essentially, I think the task as parents is you want to be able to have your kids say those thank yous
Right.
to you.
Right. Wow, what an awesome idea.
Thank
and
you.
so again, your book is available on Amazon.
Yes.
I'm sure it'll be on your doorstep in 24 hours.
Right, exactly.
For that instant gratification that we're all looking for.
Right.
Thank you, Covie. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you, Rama.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Perfect.